how it goes, but kia ora koutou, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou katoa. My name is Sionainn Byrnes, and I am a member of the Canterbury Socialist Society. I'm also a learning specialist at Christchurch City Libraries, which means that I am part of the informal and small CSSCCLC. I'm about a year out from having graduated with a PhD in English from the University of Canterbury, where I studied post-colonial literature and specifically a mode of writing known as magical realism. I've given a few talks for the CSS in the past 3 years or so, and quite a few before that as well. But I have to admit that this is the one of every talk I've given that I've struggled the most with, precisely because I'm actually equipped to deliver it. Usually I sort of read a few things and I feel like I get the general gist of things, and I have a 50-minute talk to give that's, you know, quite simple and makes a lot of narrative sense. This one, we'll see how it goes. A little bit of knowledge is bad, and maybe too much is also bad as well. So I've titled this talk Solitude or Solidarity, and in the Facebook description for this event, Thomas pointed out that this is a reference to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 1967 novel, 100 Years of Solitude, of which I promise you'll hear more soon. This talk is very loosely based on my PhD thesis, minus the magic, unfortunately. And in fact, I want to state quite clearly that, as far as I'm concerned, this talk is a provocation. And in academic terms, that means that I'm not exactly sure where this talk is going to go, but I know that there's something useful in it, and I want you to consider that useful thing. I think there might be more than one, but I'll leave it up to you. So I intend to talk about the uneasy, if not downright inimical or hostile relationship between post-colonialism and Marxism. But more than that, or at least tonight, my goal is to situate some of the tendencies and ideologies that have become associated with post-colonial thought and politics. Don't worry, I've only written notes for the first 2 slides of this talk, so I'll only use this bit for maybe 2 minutes longer. But since so much ground has been lost on the left, and I mean that quite literally, ground, and I'll come back to that in my very literary student pun on solidarity, my goal tonight is also to state some minimum claims to a universal historical material reality across the colonial divide, and that has been effaced almost entirely from politics recently. So 2 things before I start. One, I'm very unlikely to solve, let alone posit some of the most pressing issues related to post-coloniality and colonisation. I have some ideas, and I might give them to you in a later slide, but I'm more interested in what people have to say about that. I'm also going to frame this talk in terms of literature, so there will be some readings. I hope that you're into literature and being read to, but there are a few legitimate reasons why I've chosen to do that. So first off, literature is what I know and what I am trained in, and it's how I came to access a lot of the sort of topics and issues that come up in this talk. But also, post-colonialism and post-colonial studies is quite unique in some of the sort of political trends that we see recently, or historically, in that it actually originates in the academy. It is a creature of academic thought, and I hope to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. So, the third reason that I've chosen to talk about this in terms of literature, and hopefully as you'll come to see, is that post-colonial ideologies and thoughts, the hegemonic ones, the ones that dominate the way that we think about these kind of politics, I would say plagued by an anxiety that has to do with the impossibility or the supposed impossibility of understanding across the colonial divide. So the idea that people have been colonised and those who are descended from those who have colonised, there is just no way that we can understand each other, or that even more broadly we have experiences that are impenetrable to others. I would argue that there are very few books. Did I get loud for you? Yes, I got loud then, that's okay. I would argue that there are very few books, some, but few, that have been written deliberately not to be understood. And fewer readers still who read books deliberately not to understand. And so I think that literature and the sort of act of writing and reading stands against maybe at least one of the tendencies that I perceive in sort of dominant hegemonic thought related to post-coloniality. So, the last bit of my notes is I hope you like being read to. Let's see how we go. So what I intend to talk about this evening, and I'm aiming for maybe 40 minutes or so, I would really like to have a break in a discussion, so that this is a nice night out for all of us. But what I'm hoping to talk about is, first off, this thing called the Postcolonial Unconscious. That is a reference. The Postcolonial Unconscious is a title, first off, of a book by a guy called Neil Lazarus. And it was published in 2011. He's a Marxist post-colonial theorist, and actually in the minority because of that. So writing against the grain of post-colonial theory. His book is a reference to a book by Friedrich Jameson called The Political Unconscious, which is from 1981. And Friedrich Jameson is sort of interesting. He's sort of like a little bit Marxist, a little bit postmodernist. And I promise I'll do my best to talk about what I mean by these terms soon. But basically, the idea is that this title is about all those things, those unconscious suppositions and assumptions that we make about something, as if they aren't political before we even get to the political thing. So we might talk about post-coloniality, but before we get to that, we've already made a lot of assumptions about, you know, what counts or what doesn't count as part of that, and what are significant and meaningful in terms of post-colonial politics. And I hope that you'll come to see that unfortunately the post-colonial unconscious could basically be read as post-Marxism. So after that, I hope to talk a little bit about how post-colonial Marxism, or what I mean by that is how Marxism has in fact been meaningful to post-colonial territories and populations. So often you'll hear the claim that Marxism is a white man's ideology. I don't know where that leaves like the likes of white women or whatever, but it's a very condescending claim insofar as it absolutely effaces the contributions that have been made to Marxism by, or socialism, by people outside of the West. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Regardless of whether Marxism has been meaningful to post-colonial territories or populations, it's also fair to say that Marxism has stuff to offer to the way that we think about post-colonialism. So that's kind of where I intend to go after that. And then I want to end this, a la the provocation, with this idea of differences that matter, because difference is the fundamental idea in post-colonial theory, that people are either fundamentally or radically, self-affirmatively different from their colonisers. But how does that sort of marginalise people in the process? So this is kind of a trajectory that I'm going in. So I don't know how many people are familiar with, probably everyone, post-colonial politics, post-colonial thought. If you think about it in yourself, I'm sure that you would have an idea, if you've read anything or read Twitter lately or, you know, whatever, you'd have an idea of what kind of like values we associate with post-colonialism. And often they are to do with difference. so like a radical positive affirmation of difference. These things, I will signpost, are evident in post-colonial literature and thought. The extent to which they sort of eclipse other things is my problem, but we'll come back to that. So the idea that difference, it's all about difference. We are fundamentally and essentially different from those who have colonized us in an ahistorical way. Also, that's about multi-narrativity, and that just means like lots of stories at once and lots of truths at once. You know, competing claims to what might be real and true. That it's about identity. I feel like that's pretty self-evident. Unfortunately, the way that post-colonialism is framed as a politics at the moment is that difference and multi-narrativity come to be associated with identity and not an external world. So you are different because of yourself, because you have a different idea of what happens in the world, not because that has been created through historical material circumstances. And also unintelligibility is a thing too. And that is the idea that it's very hard if you haven't experienced something to understand what it is. Hopefully that makes sense. But this is also, again, the idea is that it's a radically self-affirming sense of unintelligibility. That, like, I sort of say this so to make it clear that you can't understand where I've come from or what my experiences have been. And I think that's actually a really, like, condescending and problematic thing. You know, not whatever. This stuff doesn't come from nowhere. And I hope, at least very briefly, to situate these things. So in fact, I'm going to use Neil Lazarus, who I mentioned before, who wrote a book called Postcolonial Unconscious. And I think he puts it really simply. So this kind of stuff that we associate with post-colonialism wasn't always the way it was. Before the late 1970s, there was no field of academic specialisation or any field at all that went specifically by the name of post-colonial studies, least of all a field of politics, right? This is not, of course, to say that there was no work being done before the late 1970s on issues relating to post-colonial cultures and societies. It was very loud to myself. In every academic discipline, there were presses specialising in the publication of material relating to post-colonial issues. The word post-colonial occasionally appeared in the scholarship, but did not mean then what it has come to mean in post-colonial studies. The word post-colonial, was a periodizing term, an historical and not an ideological concept. Colonial territories that had been decolonized were post-colonial states. It was as simple as that. So in the 1970s, to describe a place, or less likely a population, as post-colonial would have been a historical material term, a descriptive term, to say that you had been colonized and now you were in some period post-colonization, whether that was independent or whatever. It was to acknowledge the historical material fact of colonization. It didn't suggest a politics or a goal or anything like that. It was actually to recognize, a historical material moment. That is not the case now. So I think you would be less likely to think that post-colonial means something actually quite temporal or specific historically now. It actually denotes more of a politics. And how did that happen? So what happened was a few kind of movements coalesced. So this is super dense and I feel bad, but I'll do my best to succumb this part of the talk. But in the late 1970s and early 80s, at the time, as Neil Lazarus says, when post-colonial was a descriptive term and not a denotative term, it didn't denote an ideology or a politics. You had people who subscribed or were kind of adventing this idea of post-structuralism. So initially, in linguistics, you had people called structuralists, and they believed that across all languages there were commonalities. There was a kind of structure that was universal to all languages, didn't matter if it was English or whatever. And they believed that that structure was based in binaries. So in order to have a language, you had to have certain kind of material bases in these binaries, light and dark, or left and right. And these sort of things structured the way that all languages evolved, and therefore the way that all kind of thought evolved. Post-structuralists at this time started to react against that orthodoxy. And they said, well, not necessarily, there aren't these same rules, that's quite presumptive. But also, they reacted against the idea that what you mean to infer, the signified, and what you use to describe that your signifier are always related. So they said language as a whole, essentially a thing about power. There's space in language between what we say and what we mean, and that space can be co-opted by structures of power, essentially. So they started talking about this kind of dispersion of power through language. And actually, in fact, post-structuralism was meant to initially be kind of in support of Marxism. You had a critical mass of French theorists who were very influenced by Marxism, who were sort of thinking a little bit about, I guess, the superstructure of how things other than the economic structure might reinforce capitalism. So how this kind of capitalist structure could be enforced through ideology. In fact, people started to stray a little bit away from that by being like, oh, what else could be, inserted into the space between what we say and what we meant. But anyway, so there's that kind of stuff. This idea of a sense of arbitrariness in language. Similarly, at the same time, there were a lot of changes in, I guess, not necessarily modes of production, but the ways of production. So in the decades after World War II, in the richest places of the world, you had a sense that we are post-industrial now, that like we don't, necessarily have to make stuff in the same way, or at least not at the same rate of the population. Changes in the kind of jobs that people did, so not necessarily always on a factory. By the time of the 80s, like a lot of bureaucratic office jobs, changes in labour and production. And this caused some people to think that perhaps there had been a shift in the way that modes of production worked, that maybe, capitalism was changing or our mode of production was changing. Also, modernity, which predates postmodernism, was kind of characterised by the idea that everything was new. And by the time you get to the 80s, you have this idea that actually nothing is new, we're not really making new things, it's sort of a matter of repurposing stuff. So a little bit jaded in that way. In 1989, you have the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and then in 1991, the dissolution finally of the Soviet Union. So there's also the sense that communism has proved a failure, and that Marxism too. A lot of people will, kind of thinking, well, Marxism didn't live up to it. It said that if we had communism, we would then go on to, this was a kind of prescriptive idea of how societies would evolve, but that didn't happen. So that's it. A sense that none of these ideas of how the world was going to be actually panned out, and also then, subsequently the rise of neoliberalism, and all throughout this, from post-structuralism to neoliberalism, you had an emphasis on the individual as the source of knowledge and truth. So whether it's in the language that they use and what they intend, or whether it's in, whatever, a growing sense of the individual being the source of politics. Right. In terms of post-colonial studies, cultural studies, literary studies, this is also a really interesting time, the 1980s. There's a lot of really important works in the Western canon of post-colonial literature were in fact written in the 1940s, 50s and 60s. But always in literature, there is a time of lag with translation. And so it took at least a couple of decades for the literary industry, the publishing industry, to think, where can we outsource some lucrative works, but also where can we employ people to sort of translate stuff. And so in the 80s, you had the translation into English of a real, vast variety of works of literature that had been published under different conditions, either colonized or post-colonial, particularly in Latin America, but elsewhere as well. So there's always a lag there between what has become popular in the Western reading world and what those books are actually writing about, which predates, what people are reading, the context in which people are reading them. So things are lost, and in writing for Postcolonial Unconscious also read into gain in translation. And all of this is to say that when post-colonial studies finally was formalised through cultural studies and through literary studies, it was influenced by all of these changes in the world. And as Lazarus describes it, post-colonial studies is a curious, or was then and remains probably still, a curious and unstable combination of post-Marxist and anti-nationalist philosophical discourse, identity politics, postmodernism and multiculturalism, the whole ensemble sometimes leavened by post-structuralist epistemology. And that's all well and good. Unfortunately, what this overlooks is the extent to which colonisation has always had an economic imperative. Colonisation is not just a thing that happened for fun. There was always a reason. Some people may have heard of the term primitive accumulation before. At its most simplest, it just means the way that when capital runs out of ways to generate free money or free stuff to capitalise, it looks further afield. So it might be incorporating women into work, or it might be colonising places in order to get free labour, or in order to gain material resources from places like sugar, coffee, whatever. I'm going to think about that in terms of Haiti in a moment. Colonisation primarily also, while ideologically it has been justified as a sort of betterment of people across the world, that's not the reason that it existed or flourished. This kind of idea of post-colonialism also doesn't recognise the fact that colonisation served a particular purpose in terms of cementing the capitalist world system. So in Africa or Latin America, or actually really anywhere, colonisation served a purpose to capitalise, to integrate previously uncapitalised societies into a capitalist world system upon which they were then reliant, so that afterwards, even when colonial powers either moved themselves away voluntarily or ejected, the economy itself still remained capitalised and therefore dependent on a particular kind of mode of production. It also doesn't recognise the fact that colonists were actually pretty smart in the way that they colonised places. So they didn't always just go into places and be like, let's just kill everyone who lives here, or let's just, oppress everyone who lives here. Often, colonisers worked with existing class hierarchies so that they would woo sort of those that at the top of the existing hierarchy in ideological way, say like, oh, you'll benefit lots if you come onto our side. And working class and peasant populations were suffering the more exacting end of colonisation, so dispossession from land and taxes and death and forced labour and stuff like that. So colonisation itself was experienced in different ways according to class, or the kind of class hierarchies that existed before colonisers existed. It Finally, this kind of stuff doesn't recognise the fact that Marxism, or a class analysis, has in fact been really meaningful to colonised populations and territories. Again, I think I mentioned before, you hear a lot this idea that Marxism is a white man's politics or ideology, which is very condescending to those in Africa and Latin America and the US who have found Marxism in a class analysis, even if not in name necessarily Marxism, to be a way of resisting colonial powers in politics. This is my Muslim Dyson. Can you please bring me a charger? Oh God, have I talked that long already? So what I want to do is get into what I consider to be the fun stuff. And so like, on the one hand, you have this emphasis on things around difference, multi-narrativity, identity, and unintelligibility, right? And on the other hand, you have this account of the world where matter matters, and people are put down to a kind of material imperative. And what I want to do is read you a couple of excerpts and ask you to think a little bit about how these concepts of difference, multi-narrativity, identity, and unintelligibility are of course present and relevant, but not so much in the way that they have been made meaningful. So the first book that I want to tell you about is a book called The Kingdom of This World. And it's by an author called Alejo Carpentier. So he's a Cuban, actually musicologist and artist. But in this novel he writes about the Haitian Revolution of 1804. And Gareth, was it, who did a really great talk for the CSS maybe a year ago or so about the Haitian Revolution. I recommend that if we can find it, we do find it and listen to it. The Haitian Revolution was the first major and really only slave uprising in history. It occurred not because of, but thanks, supported by the French Revolution as well, that had happened, slightly before it. So Haiti initially was a French colony, and it was very profitable in terms of sugar, coffee, and slaves, so people. What happened was when the revolution occurred and the French landowners were ejected, those people who took on the government then instituted a system of corvée, or forced labour, where people were conscripted to farm and build and essentially go back to the plantations that they had revolted against being kept in. And so you had, and this is me talking about the capitalisation of economies through colonisation, colonisers were ejected, but the economy was so now dependent on capital that it required plantations to run in the exact same way that they had under colonisation, and so the system itself didn't actually change. And so I'll just read you a couple of pages. The protagonist of this novel is called Noel, and he experiences all of this as initially a slave and then a slave. All the land around the village of Milo was tended like a garden, geometrically aligned irrigation ditches and flower beds green with tender seedlings. Many people were working these fields under the vigilance of soldiers carrying whips who occasionally shied a stone at some laggard. Prisoners, thought Noel to himself as he observed that the custodians were Negroes, but that the workers were too, which ran counter to certain notions he had picked up in Santiago de Cuba on the nights when he had been able to attend some festive gathering of the French Negroes. But the old man stood still in his tracks, awed by the most unexpected, most overwhelming sight of his long existence. Against a background of mountains, violet stripped by deep gorges, rose a rose-coloured palace, a fortress with ogival windows, rendered almost ethereal by the high socle of its stone stairway. To one side stood long-roofed sheds that were probably workshops, barracks, stables. The other stood around building crowned by a cupola resting on white columns, where surpliced priests went in and out. As he drew nearer, Tinoel could make out terraces, statues, arcades, gardens, pergolas, artificial brooks, and boxwood mazes. At the foot of heavy columns, which supported a great sun of black wood, 2 bronze lions stood guard. Across the main esplanade, white uniformed officers busily came and went. Young captains in bicorns, reflecting the glitter of the sun, sabres rattling on their thighs. Through an open window came the sound of a dance orchestra in full rehearsal. In the palace windows, ladies were visible, wearing plumed headdresses, their full busts pushed up by the high waistlines of their fashionable gowns. In a patio, 2 coachmen were polishing a huge gilded coach covered with suns in bas relief. As he paused before the circular building from which the priests had emerged, Tinoel saw that it was a church hung with curtains, banners, and canopies, which housed an image of the Immaculate Conception. But what surprised Tinoel most was the discovery that this marvellous world, the like of which the French governors of the Cap had never known, was a world of Negroes, because those handsome, firm-buttock ladies circling in a dance around a fountain of tritons were negresses. Those 2 white-hosed ministers descending the main stairway with leather dispatch cases under their arms were Negroes. Negro was the chef, with an ermine tail on his cap, who was receiving a deer borne on the shoulders of several villagers, led by the master huntsman. Those hussars curveting about the riding ring were Negroes. That high steward with a silver chain around his neck, watching, in the company of the royal falconer, the rehearsals of Negro actors in an outdoor theatre, was a Negro. Those footmen in white wigs, whose gold buttons were being inspected by a butler in green livery, were Negroes. And finally, Negro, good and Negro, was that Immaculate Conception standing above the high altar of the chapel, smiling sweetly upon the Negro musicians who were practicing salva. Tinoel realised that he was at Sans-Souci, the favourite residence of King Henri Christophe. A heavy blow landed across the old man's back. Before he could utter a protest, a guard was herding him, with kicks in the behind, toward one of the barracks. When he found himself locked in a cell, Tinoel began to shout that he was personally acquainted with Henri Christophe, and he even believed he had heard that he was married to Marie-Louise Trueba, the niece of a free lace maker who had often come to the plantation of Lenormand de Maisy. But nobody paid any attention to him. In the afternoon, he was led with other prisoners to the foot of Le Bonnet de la Bec, where great piles of building materials lay. He was handed a brick. Take that up and come back for another one. So I feel like this is an incredible novel. I hope you enjoyed that. I did. Enjoyed reading it. The whole idea here is that difference is, of course, a relevant topic, if only insofar as things aren't different. You know, in terms of who is your master and who is the slave or what they look like, the relationship between the power dynamic has not changed. And we see this later. And we get this small bit when Tinoel thinks walking up and down and up. Tinoel began to think that the chamber music orchestras of Sans-Souci, the splendour of the uniforms and the statues of naked white women soaking up the sun on their scrolled pedestals among the sculptured boxwood hedging of flower beds, were all the product of a slavery as abominable as that he had known on the plantations. Right, so difference does matter, but not in the way that is necessarily being emphasised in terms of post-colonial studies. This is where you have to listen to me for a really long time, as if you haven't been listening to me already, but like listening in a very a more intense way. So this is my sort of like rebuttal to difference. And I am being selective, but so too are other post-colonial theorists. I'm being selective against what they select. So in terms of multivocality, This idea that, oh, there are many truths and there are many stories, and they all equally have claims in the world. I'd like to introduce you to 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and if you haven't read it, you should. But at this point, basically, it's talking about the United Fruit Company, which really, really existed and really did sort of exploit its workers, not only in Colombia, but elsewhere in Latin America. So at this point we have, on Monday night, the leaders of the union were taken from their homes and sent to jail in the capital of the province with 2-pound irons on their legs. Taken among them were Jose Arcadio Segundo and Lorenzo Galevan. They were set free, however, within 3 months because of the fact that the government and the banana company could not reach an agreement as to who should feed them in jail. The protests of the workers this time were based on the lack of sanitary facilities in their living quarters, the non-existence of medical services, and terrible working conditions. They stated furthermore that they were not being paid in real money but in scrip, which was only good to buy Virginia ham in the company commissaries. Jose Arcadio Segundo was put in jail because he revealed that the scrip system was a way for the company to finance its fruit ships, without which the commissary merchandise would have to return empty from New Orleans to the banana ports. The other complaints were common knowledge. The company physicians did not examine the sick, but had them line up behind one another in the dispensaries, and a nurse would put a pill the colour of copper sulfate on their tongues, whether they had malaria, gonorrhea, or constipation. It was a cure that was so common that children would stand in the line several times, and instead of swallowing the pills, would take them home to use as bingo markers. The company workers were crowded together in miserable barracks. The engineers, instead of putting in toilets, had a portable latrine for every 50 people brought to the camps at Christmas time, and they held public demonstrations of how to use them so that they would last longer. The decrepit lawyers, dressed in black, who during other times had besieged Colonel Aureliano Buendia, and who were now controlled by the banana company, dismissed those demands with decisions that seemed like acts of magic. When the workers drew up a list of unanimous petitions, a long time passed before they were able to notify the banana company officially. As soon as he found out about the agreement, Mr. Brown, the banana company owner, hitched his luxurious Glaston coach to the train and disappeared from Macondo along with the more prominent representatives of his company. Nonetheless, some workers found one of them the following Saturday in a brothel, and they made him sign a copy of the sheet with the demands while he was naked with the woman who had helped to entrap him. The mournful lawyer showed in court that the man had nothing to do with the company, and in order that no one doubt their arguments, they had him jailed as an imposter. Later on, Mr. Brown was surprised travelling incognito in a third-class coach, and they made him sign another copy of the demands. On the following day, he appeared before the judges with his hair dyed black and speaking flawless Spanish. The lawyer showed that the man was not Mr. Jack Brown, the superintendent of the banana company, born in Prattville, Alabama, but a harmless vendor of medicinal plants born in Macondo and baptized there with the name Dagoberto Fonseca. A while later, faced with a new attempt by the workers, the lawyers publicly exhibited Mr. Brown's death certificate, attested to by consuls and foreign ministers, which bore witness that on June 9th last, he had been run over by a fire engine in Chicago. Tired of that hermeneutical delirium, the workers turned away from the authorities in Macondo and brought their complaints up to the higher courts. It was there that the sleight of hand lawyers proved that the demands lacked all validity for the simple reason that the banana company did not have, never had had, and never would have any workers in its service, because they were all hired on a temporary and occasional basis. So that the fable of the Virginia ham was nonsense, the same as that of the miraculous pills and the Yuletide toilets, and by a decision of the court it was established and set down in solemn decrees that the workers did not exist. There are certainly many claims to truth in that excerpt, certainly many stories. They aren't necessarily something to be celebrated in terms of multivocality, and in fact it's furthermore a kind of alienation from a material reality that gives power to people who have been colonised. And later on, a strike begins. There is sort of a retelling of the 1928 banana massacre of workers in Sionainn in Colombia. People were on strike. This actually happened. It happens in the novel, but it actually happened in the world. People struck. They were gunned down by the Colombian army on behalf of capital, really, the United Fruit Company, and that was then, effaced from the history books. And so we have the official version repeated 1,000 times and mangled out all over the country by every means of communication the government found at hand. It's finally accepted. There were no dead. The satisfied workers had gone back to their families, and the banana company was suspending all activity. So multivocality, again, is something that exists in post-colonial literature and in the post-colonial experience. Whether it's something that we should be celebrating or critiquing is another question indeed. Just take the time to feel like, okay, I'm going to hone through this stuff. It's still worth reading the books because they're good. I'm thinking now about identity, and this is Isabel Allende's The House of the Spirits, written in 1982. Like 100 Years of Solitude, it has stuff about multivocality and the dangers of it, the word against the will. So with a stroke, this is written under Pinochet. Isabel Allende was the goddaughter of Salvador Allende, who was the first democratically elected president, Marxist president in, if not Latin America, the world. Yeah. So there was a military coup in 1973 that lasted the Pinochet dictatorship until 1990.
Which was also a 9/11.
It was also a as people
Which
say,
no
the original
one
9/11.
mentions.
Yeah.
The farmer that died from that in the Twin Towers.
Yeah. But again, we wouldn't even know the numbers because they've all been disappeared in the Ashkarma. So, well, who knows? Anyway. So she writes, with a stroke of the pen, the military changed world history, erasing every incident, ideology and historical figure of which the regime disapproved. They adjusted the maps because there was no reason why the North should be placed on top, so far away from their beloved fatherland, when it could be placed on the bottom, where it would appear in a more favourable light. And while they were at it, they painted vast areas of Prussian blue territorial waters that stretched all the way to Africa and Asia, and appropriated distant countries in the geography books, leaping borders with impunity until the neighbouring countries lost their patience. So it helped in the United Nations and threatened to send in tanks and planes. Censorship, which at first covered only the mass media, was soon extended to textbooks, song lyrics, movie scripts, and even private conversations. There were words prohibited by military decree, such as the word compañero, and others that could not be mentioned, even though no edict had swept them from the lexicon, such as freedom, justice, and trade union. The interesting thing about The House of the Spirits, published in 1982, like Isabel Allende, is that most people in post-colonial studies, most theorists, agree that this is not a work of post-colonial literature because it's about Pinochet. Because it's a different thing. It's not actually about, it has nothing to do with colonization, as if the Pinochet dictatorship weren't made possible by, first off, colonization and second off, economic imperialism. And this, I think, to me, demonstrates how always we have this idea of what it means in terms of identity to be truly post-colonial. It doesn't actually count historically, materially. You need to appeal to a particular identity. So in lieu of it qualifying as an easy post-colonial novel, people will always read it as a woman's novel. Because if you can't be post-colonial, well, at least you can be a woman. That's another identity. And so I just want to read very quick that at the start. So the titular House of the Spirits, in which the families live over the years, ends up being sort of like appropriated and repurposed and remade by the matriarch of the family, Clara. And so she makes what was once a solemn, cubic, dense, pompous house into a house full of protuberances and incrustations, twisted staircases that led to empty spaces, turrets, small windows that could not be opened, doors hanging in midair, crooked hallways and portholes that linked the living quarters so that people could communicate during the siesta. And people will tend to read this as like, this is a radical affirmation of the difference of women, of like the different kind of houses, the irrational kind of houses that they would build if they could, you know, this sort of thing. Never minding that initially the house was built and made by a French architect who had building materials imported from all over the world. Esteban, the patriarch, wants his house to be the only one with German stained glass windows, mouldings carved in Austria, faucets of English bronze, Italian marble floors and special locks ordered by Postcolonial from the United States, which drive the flowing instructions and the keys, which I think is testament to the kind of irrationality that occurred at the kind of this jumble of modernity that happened in Latin America. So it's very interesting that, again, a selective reading of what it means, either, it's a product of production and distribution, or it's a product of weird women who want to live in crazy houses. You know, I don't want to live in a crazy house. Last one, I promise. Getting to unintelligibility, this idea that we cannot understand each other because if we haven't experienced the same things, these things are too far apart in the world. This is a book called Lagoon. It was published in 2014 by a Nigerian-American author called Nibio Korafor, and it's a response to District 9, which is a horrendous movie that I'll say more about in a second, but basically it's like, sort of like the analogy is in District 9 that like, it's like, oh, it's apartheid, but no, in this version, Black Africans are sort of insect prawns, and this is a response to that, right? So you have a marine biologist and a couple of other people, a rapper, a soldier. They come together. They are the first people who meet extraterrestrials who land in Lagos, Nigeria, and who are super cool and can rearrange themselves atomically. And insist on meeting the president. So Adaora stepped forward. My name is Adaora, she said. I'm a marine biologist. This is Iodeli. She is one of them, one of the extraterrestrials. She is their ambassador. She was the first to make contact, and she seeks an audience with you, Mr. President. We've gone through a lot to get her here. The soldiers pointed their guns at Iodeli as they moved to shield the president. I move aside, the president snapped at the soldiers, becoming a little more animated. Do any of you think you can save my life? Look at me, I'm nearly dead already. He muttered something in Hausa. Come, he said, looking at Iodeli. She stepped up to him. Her long braids blew in the soft breeze. Both of the young soldiers holding up the president looked terrified. Above, the dark sky was warming as sunrise approached. Are you truly a stranger, an extraterrestrial, an alien? Yes. You look like a woman from Ecoland. Looks can be deceiving. He chuckled wearily and coughed. Prove it. She paused, then she said, watch closely. Even as she spoke, her words were falling apart, disappearing into the din of metal walls on glass, shifting and reshaping along with her body. The soldiers guarding the president dropped their guns, the wives screamed, and one of his advisors fainted. The pilot fell to his knees and began to vomit. The president watched with wide eyes. Thankfully, the two soldiers carrying him did not drop him, though one of them started to sob and the other seemed to be having trouble breathing. Iodeli was now a broad-shouldered, stocky white man in a blue uniform with bushy grey hair and beard and haunted eyes. He had a moustache like a handlebar. Iodeli, the man, put her hands on her hips and cocked her head. The president's mouth fell open. Karl Marx? He whispered. I know, Iodeli said in a manly voice. She stepped closer to him, graceful in her man's body. You believe in Marxism, yet you are too powerless to enact it. And then later, as if this wasn't enough, to prove that, like, in order to be understood by everyone and to have people's doubts kind of like erased, you had to become Karl Marx to be like universal. Taking that one step further. This alien sort of diplomat person ends up hosting a kind of like media thing where the president of Nigeria makes a statement and she puts her hand in the camera and makes it go to all the world through all of their screens, right? So a technician says 5, 4, 3, 2. He motioned to the president and the red light lit up. The president was on the air. The woman who was not a woman's fingertips were in the camera. Again it hit him. Oh God, he thought. He looked into the camera, his brilliant words escaping him. So much of Nigeria was seeing him right now, even in the most rural places. These days, more often than not, someone carried a mobile phone or listening to television or a computer. He sat up straight. This was his time. Greetings, Nigeria, he said. He was strong, he was healthy, his country was seeing him, the world would see him. This was the most positive thing to come out of Nigeria in a long time. Let the world watch, the president thought. Let them see that we are mighty. This is a historic moment for our nation, he began, for it marks an important milestone in our march towards a maturing democracy. The president had never been a great orator, but today, this early evening, he was feeling swerves. He was tasting them. They were humming to the rhythm of his soul. He smiled as he spoke. For the first time since we cast off the shackles of colonialism, over half a century ago, since we rolled through decades of corruption and internal struggle, we have reached the tipping point, and here in Lagos we have passed it. Many of you have seen the footage on the internet or heard the news from loved ones. Last night Lagos burned, but like a phoenix it will rise from the ashes, a greater creature than ever before. The occasion that has put me here before you tonight is momentous. It marks another kind of transitional shift. Now listen closely to me. The shift is cause for celebration, not panic. There are others amongst us here in Lagos. Excuse me. They intend to stay, and I'm happy about it. They have new technology, they have fresh ideas that we can combine with our own. Hold tight, we will be powerful again. People of Lagos, especially look at your neighbour. See his race, tribe, or his alien blood, and call him brother. We have much work to do as a family. And yet, the abiding perception or impression of post-colonial literature is that it exists not to be understood, and that it exists to maintain the unintelligibility of one experience from another. What we actually see in the literature, let alone in historical matter, is that there is always an appeal to be understood, and people are often willing to understand. These are pictures of books that I got very behind on. And so really in terms of my provocation, I'm starting to wind up here, thank God, is that there has been a real mythologization of what it means to be post-colonial and what kind of politics, are ascribed and legitimate for post-colonial populations and territories. And when I say mythology, again, I'm being a little bit academic and nerdy, and thinking about a guy called Roland Barthes, who has a book called Mythology. And when he talks about myth, he defines it as something, myth occurs when things lose the memory that they once were made. So they exist ahistorically, that's a myth. And I feel like that's what has occurred in our understanding of colonization, post-coloniality, and of difference. We know that these things occurred, but we don't bother to really care about the specificity of how they were made, nor do we think about, how the thoughts that we have around post-coloniality were also made, and who they might serve in the process. Because I'm not sure that the kind of cleaving of people according to their different ontological categories is actually useful in terms of our kind of wellness and our actually providing justice to colonised populations and are actually moving forward. And I think the antidote to this is to think about colonisation and post-coloniality in terms of specific historical matter, specific times, you know, when matter created experiences. And I put vibrant in parentheses there because matter doesn't always, you know, it's not dead and it doesn't always behave in ways that we might expect. This is part of the magic stuff that I unfortunately have to cut out of this talk, but it does appear in my thesis by it if it ever becomes a book. But that's okay. Without a sense that we all live in the same world and that we all share in common a material reality and a historical material reality, as far as I'm concerned, there is no accountability to other people or to history. We can all make claims on the world, you know, but to what are we accountable and to who? Right? We just end up replaying the same stuff. As I kind of said in the first instance, I'm not sure that I can solve, let alone identify. I'm not in a position, I'm not the right person to ask what are the main issues that we sort of face right now. But I can imagine that given ecological crises, and the human crises that they will inevitably spark in terms of movement of people and the disposition of people from land, that is a material issue that we're going to have to deal with at some point, and that ontological difference will not sort of help. Public health, we're sort of aware of it now. Nationalism is a really interesting issue because in terms of post-colonialism, because often the idea is that we haven't had a nation yet, and so we need that in order to become internationalist. I don't really know about that. That's a question for the old Marxists out there. So I'm sure Thomas can help me on that. But you know, beyond all of these bad things that we have to grapple with, also how can we have a life that is good, that we all enjoy, and that we, you know, where we have nice things. I'm not sure that that's achievable without us first acknowledging that we all live in the same world, right? Thinking about the kind of stuff that I started this off with, these ideas of difference and multivocality and identity and unintelligibility. Unfortunately, in the context of neoliberalism and capital, these things, you know, while they are important and they exist, in people's experiences in literature and history, they don't stay that way for long under capital. So instead of having, you know, a kind of idea about difference, that actual differences, like the kind of colonisation that occurred, whether it was a settler colonialism, whether that settler has stayed, you know, the actual specific historical matter of it, we end up just having an essentialist kind of idea of what colonisation means. It's like, colonisation was this, what is the historical matter? Nothing. All difference becomes difference from something rather than difference in and of itself. I hope that makes sense. I'm willing to answer questions. Multivocality, competing claims to truth. We live in a world of alternative facts, and I fail to see how claims of multivocality are radical when we live in a world where we can't even acknowledge that, like, people are going to die from certain things. So I fail to see how that's a radical affirmation of, you know, that is going to support and take care of the most marginalised people. Yeah. Identity we see become bastardised as well in terms of choice, so that rather than actually, you know, being a person, you get to choose to be a person. And in terms of unintelligibility, well, if we can't understand each other, we may as well just give up. I think that we can, lay minimum claims to a world where we can try and read or talk to one another. I'm going to wrap up now. This has been a very stressful time for me. I hope it hasn't been as stressful for you. But I'd like to leave you with, actually, I'm going to come back after this video, so it's not that good. But this is a video by a guy called Trueba. He's written an incredible book called Postcolonialism and the Spectre of Capital. Again, another Marxist post-colonial theorist. And I think he's just really fucking honest in this clip, and I really enjoy it. So I'd like you to listen to it if that's okay. Oh, it doesn't play. Why is there no volume through this?
It's just quiet.
Oh, it's really quiet. Oh, hang on. I don't even know where the sounds come out of.
The argument that Eastern people are not motivated by material ends. The argument that the culture of these parts of the world is so different that Western categories can never understand it. The argument that notions of reason, science, rationality are Western concepts is not the first body of thought to make this argument. This was in fact the founding stone, the essence of colonial ideology in the 19th century. For 100 years, the entire left railed against the notion that brown, black, yellow people are essentially different from white people. For 100 years, it was a pillar of progressive thought to affirm the common humanity of people across the world, which did not in any way erase or deny their differences. It simply affirmed that those differences did not go so deep as to put them in different moral and ontological universes. The idea that those universes are fundamentally different was something that British and French colonizers insisted upon, because it was on the basis of the denial of that common humanity that they sought to justify the denial of basic rights. It is impossible, I would submit, in today's world. It's simply impossible to revitalize the left as we must do if we're going to save humanity from the ecological crisis, from the global spread of capitalism. It's simply impossible to do so if we continue to deny our common humanity. If we continue to deny that it is capitalism spread across the world that has imperiled our future as human beings.
Today I used iMovie at work to put that together. You're welcome. So these truly are the final words. I titled this talk Solitude or Solidarity, because that was kind of how can we read the history of this? And I hope that I've made it clear, that it's not a one or the other. This, however, how I end is more of an ultimatum. It's not really a question. We choose solidarity, or we are condemned to solitude. We choose to live in a world that we all share. Well, as far as I'm concerned, we give up now. And so I just want to end with a little bit from Gabriel Garcia Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude, because I can't take credit for sort of thinking of the word solitude in terms of alienation from historical material reality. This existed in Garcia Marquez, but this is actually from his Nobel Prize acceptance speech when he won the Nobel Prize for 100 Years of Solitude, and he ends it by saying, "We, writers, people, humans, the inventors of tales, who will believe anything, feel entitled to believe that it's not yet too late to engage in the creation of utopia, a new and sweeping utopia of life, where no one will be able to decide for others how they die, and where the race is condemned to 100 years of solitude, alienation, to sort of gaslighting, will have at last and forever a second opportunity on earth." That's it, folks. Goodbye.
Sort of take a speaking order if we've got questions. So, yeah, by all means, relieve yourself, wave to the bar staff for beverages, but also wave at me if you have a question.
We can have a little 5-0.
Yeah, we can also do break first, questions later.
I'll throw that idea.
Yeah. Shannon needs a break, so
It will be available.
yeah, give it a couple of minutes to formulate questions and get comfortable, and then regroup.
Mm-hmm.
And I can prepare a speaking order if anyone comes up with things. I'll get out of the way of the live stream. Yeah.
I don't want to be in the live stream.
You have been this whole time, but I was just realizing it's like mostly colleagues. You're welcome to chess at 11 other people.
Did you follow that too?
Yeah, not too bad. I did post-colonial lit at university, so yeah. So one of my majors was but I did post-colonial was one of the papers.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think some different authors. So I wouldn't mind reading some of the books, but yeah.
So post-colonial basically means the attitudes after all the colonists died. The next lot of people carried on. They basically carried on ideas.
Not necessarily, but some did. So it wasn't possible. So it really means that the post-colonial really means that thinking of people have been colonised once the colonisers have left, whether it was the national liberation movement, like say the Vietnamese had, or whether it was the colonies, say like in India. It's basically post-colonial literature, at least is what they've written, whether that is in the same vein as some of their, some of the rulers, or whether it's in the hope of something different or challenging some of the beliefs of the colonisers. It can be any of those. So it can be a whole variety. Which is kind of what she's saying. She's just saying that she's, in her ones, choosing, I guess, post-colonial writers who acknowledge difference but see the universality of human beings. What we have in common as human beings, which I would argue is the only way you can write a great novel. That you appeal to, and that great novel can come from any culture, like those ones that were translated into because they're talking about the universalities of human nature. They may also be talking about cultural differences and other differences, but they're also talking about those things that tie people from another country and those universalities.
Yeah, so you were able to accept what you said.
Well, for me it wasn't challenging. I probably agreed with what she said. It was my thinking when I did post-colonial lit, and I think a lot of it we see coming now, I think a lot of the rationale that we see coming now doesn't only come from post-colonial lit, but certainly there is some in post-colonial lit that is, I think, anti-humanist,